Hi, I'm Jessica Chaffin, and welcome to the Jewish Bazaar, where me and my two illustrious co-hosts, Mr. Tony Michels of the University of Wisconsin at Madison, distinguished professor. Have I got that right, Tony?
That's exactly right.
And Mr. Eddy Portnoy. I love calling you Misters because who would ever dare? Mr. Eddy Portnoy from the YIVO Institute in New York, head of exhibitions and general Michigas, I believe. Is that your title?
That's accurate.
You got a Zabar's mug right behind you while we're recording. Does that come with the job on the first day? Or
you know what? Actually, it did come with a job. It was in the office when I got here.
There you go.
Eddy, do you hold a doctorate or are you merely a mister?
I do hold a doctorate, but I try not to tell people. It's
Dr. Portnoy. Are you Dr. Michels?
Yeah,
I
of
am
course.
Dr. Michels.
I mean, of course.
Yeah.
Tony is totally the type who'd go through the whole thing and then not do the last piece and not get the doctor. Am I right, Tony? How long did it take you to defend your thesis or whatever you have to do to become a doctor?
I didn't even have to do it. I submitted it. I submitted my thesis in August. I don't know what year, and then I was a doctor magically, suddenly, and a professor.
What did you do your thesis on? And Eddy, can I ask what you did yours on? I'm just curious.
My thesis is on the socialist Jews of yesteryear and the Yiddish culture that they built.
So still sticking to that program. Pretty strongly.
He's not. He
I thought it was going to be on Jewish big wave surfers, but I guess not. What are there any?
You must be thinking of Sean Thompson, the 1978 world champion.
Was he Jewish?
He was, and from South Africa.
Great Jewish athletes. That story coming next.
Great.
Not today. That's not today. Eddy, what about you?
My dissertation was on cartoons of the Yiddish press in Warsaw, New York, in the late 19th, early 20th centuries.
Was that interesting?
To it.
Not to most people, but to me.
You found it amusing.
I find that comforting in both cases. And in fact, Eddy, what you wrote your thesis on will somehow eke into or slip into what we're going to talk about today, which is Jewish murderers. I'm going to guess that there were some. You're going to tell us some stories, and I'm going to guess that there were some cartoons in some publications at that time. If we've got a murder that lines up with these dates, I don't know.
To be honest, there aren't cartoons, but there are engravings, and the reason there aren't cartoons is because these murders took place in the 1870s.
So political cartoons didn't extend to that sort of thing at that time.
Well, they didn't exist in reference to crimes as grave as murder at that time
in this community. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, so I stand corrected again, but isn't that just what this show is about? This show is a show where we take a little detour from the usual path of Jewish history and culture, and we learn a little bit more about ourselves. Some of it we like, some of it a little less so. I mean, whoever talks about Jewish murderers? No one. They talk about David Berkowitz, but wasn't he adopted?
That is what they say.
That's my favorite. The ones we'll take and the ones we won't take. Oh, David Berkowitz? No, he was adopted.
He does look remarkably like his parents.
He definitely looks like he was adopted from a Jewish family. I'll say that. Yeah.
Actually, what does 23andMe say about David Berkowitz?
I'd love to know. I would love to know. Yeah. So before we get into it, Eddy, I just want to tell people, in case they want to dig deeper when the episode is over, the murder we're about to get into is, you also write about it in your book, Bad Rabbi, which is a terrific collection of stories. I shouldn't say stories, makes it sound fictional, but blips of Jewish history. And why don't you tell people what it is so that you're the doctor.
It's stories mostly from the Yiddish press, sort of translated and retold in really small capsules, small digestible capsules.
If you like this, you'll love that. And we'll put a link in the episode notes. So, Eddy, I think you're going to kick it off for us. Is that right?
Okay. Today we're going to talk about two Jewish murderers. One of them actually accidental, but still a murder.
I believe it's
These
called
took place
manslaughter.
in that
Yeah.
is correct. These are two cases that occurred in the 1870s in New York City, and they took place at a time when there weren't a great deal of Jews uh, in the United States. It is a decade before the mass immigration of Jews from Eastern Europe, and so the community is much
Okay.
smaller, and as a result, they're perceived
So what
differently.
percentage are we talking
Um,
about?
so,
And how long have they been here?
percentage wise, well, look, Jews have been in the United States since the colonial period. Uh, since before there was a country, the first Jewish arrivals came in 1654. Um, but you know what? Maybe we should let Tony, who's more expert in these affairs, give us like a little brief overview
Give us a
of
very short context, if this is relevant to your tale, Eddy, of what we're talking about, because I think obviously these days most of us um, associate New York with having a bustling Jewish community, and I'm going to guess that at this time the Jew was more of a stranger than they are now, but maybe not.
Yeah, there was the Jewish community, let's say, by the Civil War was pretty small and new. So let's say in the 1820s, there were only about 4,000 Jews or
Oh,
so in the United States. It was pretty small. But with each decade after that, the number grew pretty substantially, so that by the 1870s, there might have been 250,000 Jews in the United States. Most of those Jews were from Central Europe, which is to say what we now consider Germany or parts of
hmm.
Austria, uh, certain parts of France, mostly from Central Europe, some from Eastern Europe. And then in the 1870s, the numbers started growing pretty significantly, and most of the people coming were from Eastern Europe, from the Russian Empire mostly. And so that by World War One, I don't know, there were about 2 million Jews in the United States. We don't have exact numbers, maybe more than that by World War One. So the 1870s was the beginning of a real large influx of Jews that grew with each decade up to World War One. What percentage of the United States? I don't know, less than 1% at the start of this story. Right by the end of the Civil War, it's under one. I think it's under
And
one
what does it
percent of the
feel
overall
like?
population.
What does New York feel like at that time, just in terms of the Jewish community? Meaning
Mm-hmm.
now, obviously, the Jewish community is a very visible and important part of the fabric of New York. I'm going to guess
Mm-hmm.
at that time it was no different than any other immigrant community where they stuck to their own little enclave and people sort of understood them and sort of didn't understand them. Is that?
To some extent, yeah. I mean, first of all, New York was much smaller. So, Harlem was farm country, the Bronx, most of Brooklyn, this is all
Mm-hmm.
rural. Um, so most of New York City is Manhattan, and then let's say from what we consider today, I don't know, the 70s and 80s down to the tip of Manhattan is New York City, and Jews are clustering in the Lower East Side, which is the home to the largest Jewish community in the United States, even at this early point. Um, at the time, the Lower East Side was called Klein Deutschland, or Little Germany. Most of the residents of the Lower East Side are Germans, not Jews. Protestants, some Catholics, German speakers. And in that overall German settlement in the Lower East Side, or Klein Deutschland, there were Jews from Central Europe, as I said before, but also a growing number of Yiddish-speaking Eastern European Jews from the Russian Empire. And that community is starting to burgeon. So by the 1890s, it's almost entirely Jewish on the Lower East Side. So at the 1870s, in a way, it's a real transitional decade from the time in which the number of Jews in New York is small, not insignificant, but still fairly small, to by the end of the decade, it was really large, and Jews were on the verge of becoming, in the early 20th century, on the verge of becoming the largest immigrant group in New York. The Irish were very big already. The Germans were especially large in the mid to late 19th century. Then come the Jews in really large numbers at the end of the late 19th century, and then
Okay.
Italians. in large numbers. So that, again, Jews are just a fairly small minority in the 1870s. By 1900, they, increasingly are defining New York's, defining New York, with more and more groups coming
Okay.
as well.
Let's get back to the murders.
So, just to Tony's point about the Jewish community in the 1870s and the increasingly large influx of Jews from Eastern Europe, in 1870 you see the publication of the very first Yiddish newspaper in the United States, and that's immediately followed by someone else saying, "This is a terrible newspaper. I'm going to make my own."
Mm-hmm.
So someone else publishes another Yiddish newspaper. None of these do especially well. The really most successful Yiddish newspaper to come out, it comes out in 1874, and that's a weekly called Yiddische Gazetten, and it that actually goes on to be quite a successful paper. But as far as the rest of the Jews go, they are a relatively, in New York, their numbers are increasing, but they're a relatively small and sort of quiet community. A lot of peddlers, small merchants, things like this. So in December 1875, a woman's body was found in a cornfield in East New York. East New York is between, I think, Brownsville and Howard Beach. And at the time, as Tony said, this was all farmland. Only sort of the core of New York City was Manhattan, and really just mostly like lower Manhattan. So Brooklyn at the time was all farmland. A farmhand finds this body in a cornfield on December 15th, 1875, and it's been slashed in the neck. There's blood all over the place. It's a gooey, gross murder. And so the farmhand goes to the farmer and tells him that he's found this body. The farmer contacts the Brooklyn police. Brooklyn is not yet part of New York City. It's its own city. And so the police come and investigate. They find a knife nearby, and they bring the body into the Brooklyn morgue. And they put out word in Brooklyn that a body was found, and if people have someone missing, they should come to the morgue and see if they can identify this body, see if it's one of their relatives. And, a few dozen people come in and no one's able to identify the body. And so the police conclude, well, maybe she came from New York, meaning, Manhattan. So they put an advertisement in a newspaper for describing this woman, what she's wearing, where she was found, and that she's no longer alive. Now, at the same time, there's a family that lives on Bayard Street on the Lower East Side, named Rubenstein, and they had a woman who worked for them named Sarah Alexander. Sarah was also a relative of theirs, but a more recently arrived and poor immigrant, and she sort of worked kind of as a maid in their house. And one of the things she did was she helped nurse her cousin, Pesach Rubenstein, back to health when he had consumption.
What a great Ellis Island name, by the way, Sarah Alexander.
Right. Actually, names didn't get changed at Ellis Island.
Well, then she didn't come here named Sarah Alexander.
No, she didn't. But also, she would have come into Castle Garden, which was the place in Lower Manhattan where before Ellis Island became the stopping off point for immigrants. But yes, it's a changed name. From what I don't know.
Sexy though. So she was nursing her cousin Pesach. Passover Rubenstein, back to help.
Passover Rubenstein, no longer such a popular name, but once a popular common name among the Jews. So as it happened, she hadn't shown up at work for a few days, and in fact, her brother John Alexander had showed up at the Rubenstein's house and asked if they had seen Sarah, because she didn't come home. So they said no, and they also said it was weird that she hadn't shown up for work. So uh, the father of the family puts an ad in the newspaper describing, saying girl missing, describing Sarah Alexander and the clothes she typically wore. When he went and bought a copy of that newspaper that he placed the ad in, he noticed another ad on the same page that had been put in by the Brooklyn police that described virtually the same person.
Dark
So,
day.
yes, very dark day for the Alexanders and the Rubensteins. So he contacted the police, who, this was in Manhattan, who then contacted the Brooklyn police. Officers from the Brooklyn Police Department came to the Rubenstein home and began interviewing the family. They told the police that the last time they saw Sarah was on a Sunday. She had helped them prepare to go to a wedding, and then she left the house and never returned. And they just never saw her again. And the following days they put ads in the newspapers. So when the police were there, they said, "Is there anyone else we should be interviewing?" And they said, "Well, maybe you should interview Pesach, but he's in Shul. He'll probably be home pretty soon." Not long thereafter, Pesach comes home. He's very surprised to see the police there. They start interviewing him about Sarah. One of the things he says, and he doesn't create any suspicion about himself in any way, but one of the things he says is that, it's weird. I had a dream that Sarah was abducted and found in a field somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And so the police are kind of like, "Oh, that's interesting. Will you come to the morgue in Brooklyn and identify the body?" And he's obviously been very close to her. She nursed him back to health. They spent a lot of time together. So when they ask him if he'll accompany them to go to the morgue, he freaks out, starts screaming, says, "Absolutely not. I will not go to the morgue." They say, "You're coming to the morgue." And they physically drag him out of the house and bring him to the morgue in Brooklyn. When they get there, they surround this table that has her body on it. It's covered up by a sheet. When they lift the sheet and he sees her face, he begins screaming hysterically, jumping up and down. They immediately arrest him. What they find when they begin in their investigation, and at this time, there's no fingerprinting. Forensics is very primitive. But what they do find is that the mud on his boots matches the mud on her clothes, and this is thought to be the mud from the field in Brooklyn. They also see that his clothing is flecked with a kind of brown spots, some kind of dried liquid that they think to be blood. And when they ask him about it, he says, "Oh, that's blood from the fish market." They also take his boots to the field in Brooklyn, and keep in mind it's December, so the ground is frozen, and they're able to match his boot to footprints in the field in Brooklyn.
That's really
And so
interesting. That's quite
actually
a case. I mean, again, talking forensics, this is very good police work, actually.
Yes. So they build a very reasonable case. It's, it's all circumstantial, but that's all that's available. They interview a variety of people. They find, as I said, they found the knife next to her body in the field. They discovered that knife is a knife that's made with 3 rivets. Apparently, most knives at the time were made with 2 rivets. And so they find the knife maker in New York City in Manhattan that makes the three rivet knives. And they interview the girl who works at the shop, and she fingers Pesach Rubenstein as having purchased a knife from them. Additionally, they find the one of the streetcar drivers that brought them to the ferry, and he points out Pesach Rubenstein as being a swarthy Polish Jew,
Hmm.
uh,
The best
who
kind.
right, who was with this woman in
But
particular. And
but yet he did remember them. Why did he remember them? Yeah.
why did he remember them? He remembered them because he said the woman wasn't wearing a hat,
Oh.
which apparently
Very
was unusual.
scandalous at this time.
This is a time when people wore
Hmm.
hats. So she
And
wasn't
he could
wearing a
see her
hat.
face. Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly. And so, the police built this case against Rubenstein. Rubenstein's family got one of the top defense lawyers in New York City to defend him.
They had that kind of money?
They all they
Or
had
the
decent money, and
community
also
raised money? Yeah.
apparently, yes, their friends and parts of the community
Hmm.
raised money in order to support Rubenstein's case, and they at the trial, the family and the defense brought in a number of witnesses that could supposedly place Rubenstein in other
Ah,
locations. Uh, Unfortunately, none of these worked out. There was always someone else. Like the prosecution basically took it apart. Um, one person said that I saw him in Shul on the day that the body, that he was supposed to be murdering this woman in East New York, and someone else said, no, I saw him in the market.
right. And he
It
couldn't
was
have
like
been they overdid
they
it. He couldn't have been in 13 places at
right.
once.
Right. They totally, they screwed it up. They even brought in someone who, uh, allegedly claimed that someone else did it. But that person couldn't keep his story straight either. And so as a result, um, and I also have to add that the trial took place in Brooklyn because that's where the body was found, and that's where the murder took place. Uh, and it was an enormously popular trial. Virtually, well, every newspaper in New York City wrote, this was front page news in every New York City newspaper. Additionally, people lined up to get into the trial just as viewers. It was a popular
What did
venue
they
for
call
for
this
entertainment.
trial, and was it the subject of, like, pamphlets and serials at that time?
Yes, right. So that comes after the
Okay.
trial when Rubenstein, and the trial takes place in uh, in March 1876. It lasts about 10 days. He's found guilty. Uh, when he's pronounced guilty, he stands up. And one of the reasons that, or one of the sort of excuses he gave, and that his some of his witnesses gave, was that Pesach Rubenstein is too religious to have committed a
Mm.
murder. He's an extremely devout man, and there's no way that he would have ever done this. Uh, so when he's pronounced guilty, he stands up, and he from behind his ears he unfurls his
Oh.
payas. He has a very long payas. He unfurls them and he says, "Do you see these? These would prevent me from committing any crime. I'm innocent."
Wow.
And with that, he's carted off to prison, the Raymond Street jail in Brooklyn, which is a notoriously horrible jail with rats and mold, and it's generally disgusting. And he's sentenced to
Can I
hang.
ask, do we know anything about, um, him? Meaning, like, did he have a job, or was he just a professional shul goer? Did this
No,
illness, I don't
right,
know how old he was, but did this illness, you always hear the stories of he was a weirdo, he tortured a cat, he did this, he did that. I know we're going to know more soon about the relationship
right,
between him and Sarah Alexander, but I'm just really curious because
right.
that's such a
So
psycho thing to do, to stand up in front of the courtroom and to pronounce himself in that way is such a like sociopathic or psychopathic thing to do.
right. Right.
He
So,
also could have
okay.
been
So
caught up in the
what,
fervor of the community.
yeah,
This is really dramatic. The trial and the community
right.
supporting him, and he's a celebrity.
Right. Well,
A,
yes,
a
in a
notorious
certain way.
celebrity, but he is the
Yes.
center of everyone's uh of the gossip in this moment of New York and of the community. Yeah.
Right. Right. So what the prosecution is able to bring out is Rubenstein's motive. So it turns out that Sarah Alexander was pregnant,
Ah,
and and
wow.
Pesach Rubenstein had found out that his wife was on her way over to New York from Poland.
Oh.
So the fact that he got his cousin pregnant when his wife was, let's say, imminently, according to 1876 terms, which means in a couple of
Sometime in
weeks,
the next 9
when
months,
she,
she's going to be here.
right,
Yeah.
when she was arriving, he felt that this was a situation that he had to take care of. Now, um, you know, abortion at the time was illegal. That was one route that could have been taken. But he didn't take that route. I think that it looks like his first, he apparently didn't speak to her. His first move was to murder her, which
So
is
she
insane.
told him that she was pregnant, and then he lured her to this cornfield and violently murdered her?
Yes. Yes.
Huh.
Yeah.
And then flashed his
I was going to
payas
say,
in
where were
court.
his pays then, Tony?
I couldn't
Under a
find
very
them.
furry hat, I
Right.
guess. It was cold.
Under a
Yeah.
hat. Did not. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's so it's so for the
That
Jewish
is a
community, this was a
fun
very upsetting.
animated show or whatever. If you think of it like someone who's about to do something terrible, and then their payas animate and come to life and become like ropes holding their arms back before they can strangle somebody.
You know,
If I was an
I could see
animator,
that
that'd
in
be kind
Big.
of fun.
I could see that in Big Mouth. That could
A
be
great
a
show,
character.
which people should watch.
They should
Yeah,
absolutely watch.
the
It's
best.
fantastic.
I happen to be the
Not familiar
voice
with it.
of, as you know, of Shannon Glazer, the mother of Jesse Glazer, one of the main characters. I also
Yes.
play a dirty hotel pillow, and a few other things. But yes, it's
I
a
love that.
great show.
I
I
love that
love that
pillow.
show. I love that show. I'm very
It's a
proud to
great
be
show.
part of that
I
show.
haven't seen it.
Your
Right.
son should watch
So,
it, Tony. Your kids would love it. How old? Yeah,
yes, actually, you know what? My kids loved it. Your kids would
yeah. It's
also love
just
it.
I'd
funny
love to
as
see
can
it.
be and dirty
You could.
and
It's a family
well,
show.
I've seen Captain
certain
Underpants.
no. This is
It's not the
very
same.
different. Yeah. But anyway, we digress. This isn't a Netflix commercial. This is
It's a Pesach
It's-
so he goes
Rubenstein
so anyway,
expose.
he declares he's not guilty. Then what? I mean, but the court has
Right.
already put him away.
Right. Right. He's guilty, and there's a motive. He's guilty.
But
It's
do we know
been written
anything
about.
else though about his life up until then, or this is just a desperate
So
man who felt cornered, and this is
he'd
what he did?
he had been in the country for about 3 years. His family, his parents, or it was actually his father and his stepmother, and I believe some of his brothers and sisters had come before him, and they probably suggested that he come as well because there was opportunity there, and he worked as a kind of jewelry peddler, sort of on the street peddling jewelry to people. I don't know how successful he was, but he obviously wasn't in good health. And I don't know how long it took for him to.
Did he have consumption or something like that, or was he just?
He had yes, he had
Uh-huh.
consumption, and as I said, Sarah Alexander was hired to nurse him back to health. She did an excellent job. She nursed him back to health so well that he managed to get her pregnant. So he's, as I said, found guilty, put in jail. He's sentenced to death, sentenced to hang. Now, in the meantime, every New York City newspaper is writing about this. And one of the amazing things that has to do with this case is that I found out, I had never heard of this case before. And at the time I came across it, I was in graduate school, and I had read, thousands of pages of texts on American Jewish history. I, had sat in hundreds of hours of classes. This seemed important, and yet I'd never
Right.
heard of it. So I went to the American Jewish history section of the library and started pulling books off shelves, looking in the indexes for Pesach Rubenstein. And I pulled about 40 or 50 books off the shelves. And I found Pesach Rubenstein in 3 books. In one book, there was two sentences written about him. In another book, there was a paragraph. And in a third book, which is a history of the Jews of Brownsville, Brooklyn, by Alter Landsman, there was about a page and a half. And that was it. And I was sort of startled because I was finding so much material in the New York City press about it. So at the time, and I want to say this is probably about 2005, 2004, 2005, a new database had come online of American historical newspapers from the 17th century to 1922, which is when at the time copyright ended, and it allowed them to put all of these digitized newspapers online. And it was searchable. So I went to this database, I put in Pesach Rubenstein and got 999 hits, which was the absolute total you could get. And what I discovered was that not only did every New York City newspaper write about this, but this was written about in virtually every single newspaper in the United States. It was almost as if it was syndicated. It was the story about the Jew murderer, or the murdered
Hebrew murder.
Jewess, the Hebrew murderer, like the Hebrew murderer of East New York. This was everywhere. And so, in the wake of the trial, as you said, there were a number of pamphlets printed. Now, murder pamphlets is a type of literature, very fascinating kind of type of American literature that begins appearing in the 19th century. They are sort of sensationalistic, often illustrated pamphlets about popular murders that took place in the U.S. Now, typically for most cases, you'd have one, maybe 2 pamphlets created for each murder. For Pesach Rubenstein, for the Pesach Rubenstein murder trial, you had 4 pamphlets created, and they're all illustrated. Him, perpetrating the murder, in the trial, praying in prison. They talk about how he wears tefillin and a tallis, and they illustrate this. And what's amazing is this is probably the first time that a popular American audience is seeing, what
Yeah,
tefillin
they're
is
really
or what a
dramatic, these
tallis
images.
is.
I've seen them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're amazing. And so because of Rubenstein's religious sensibilities, and because he's an immigrant, this becomes a sort of a Jewish affair. Uh, you know, Really up until this time, Jews aren't perceived as murderers, as threatening. They're not. The jails aren't full of Jews. Um, they're seen as reasonably upstanding citizens, and that's also the way they try to portray themselves. So the Pesach Rubenstein trial comes along and sort of destroys this image. In addition, the trial was so popular that in addition to all of these pamphlets and newspaper articles that were printed, um, the entire trial transcript was published as a book in the wake of the
Oh, and were
trial.
you able to get your hands on that book ever?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, it's
So was
amazing.
it published by a Jewish press or a non-Jewish press?
No, no, no,
So
no, no.
this
It was
is
published. It was
really
published by.
interesting though, because this is kind of like this
Yeah.
is the whole point of what we're talking about, which is that the Jewish press aren't covering this, or I'd be curious how they're
So
covering this because
One
yes,
except, well, there's a big exception there, I
and
think.
right,
how
exactly,
what is
That's
their
exactly.
version of what's happening, because that's the whole point, is like what do we want to believe about ourselves, and what one is a fact, a girl was murdered and it happened within
Right,
this community. And then there's this
right.
sensationalization of, in some ways, for this to be the first kind of big mainstream Jewish murder trial is interestingly assimilationist in a strange way, because it's like murder is such hot copy at this time that it's like you're sort of being brought into the mainstream in a way, even though there's all these strange, crazy images. And I'm curious in that writing, if it's either anti-Semitic, or I don't know how you would call that exactly, but like otherizing,
Right.
or there's a
it, it was built.
fetishism around it. And how are the Jews talking about it? Because obviously the community did everything they could to try and get this guy off, including some sloppy antics. But
Well, I think the answer depends on which language the newspaper is published in.
Right. That's exactly right.
The
so
English
So
press covered it one way, and the
so
Yiddish press
you've read
another.
some of this stuff as well, Tony?
No,
but
no, I haven't.
he has familiarity with it.
But you understand but you obviously know a lot about the context of the time that we're speaking about. So
yeah, I think generally there was a divide between what English what ran in the English press and what English-speaking Jews wanted to portray to the larger public, and what Yiddish-speaking Jews said to themselves. And the simple reason is because the simple reason for this difference is that anyone can read an English Jewish newspaper. The whole Gentile world can read it. So, the whole world is watching, and Americanized English-speaking Jews are sensitive to that. It doesn't pertain just to newspaper coverage. The same divide held true for, let's say, the vaudeville stage, where performances that Yiddish-speaking immigrants or their children loved were seen as disreputable by English-speaking Americans, because again, they were more vulnerable to the opinions of Gentiles. So this holds true from Pesach Rubenstein down for decades. There's always often a big divide between what Yiddish speakers said among themselves and what English-speaking Jews said.
Right. And to Tony's point, the general press, the general English language press, some of which is more sensationalistic than others, reports what they see in the trial. The Yiddish press at the time, which is very much a nascent press, there aren't a lot of Yiddish newspapers. They reported in Yiddish as they see it, and they see it as, this guy's a murderer. It's terrible. But it's all, and they report on the trial as, similarly in a lot of ways to the English language press, but because it's in Yiddish, they're not, as Tony said, they don't have to be embarrassed about it, because ultimately the Yiddish press is a private conversation among Jews. No one else can read it. Now, interestingly, there's a English language Jewish press, and they're humiliated by all of this. They barely write anything about it. And one of the English language newspapers is run by the Reform movement, and one of the things they comment is a dig at the Orthodox. They say, being Orthodox was not an impediment to Rubenstein being a criminal, but they write virtually nothing about the trial. Especially in comparison to the rest of the press. They act like ostriches. They just put their heads in the sand.
So
I think I just want to clarify something. It's not, Eddy's not trying to give the impression that Yiddish-speaking immigrants were indifferent to the moral implications of the murder. It's just they were open to talking about it because, as Eddy said, it's a family conversation, it's a private one, where the respectable middle-class English-speaking newspapers viewed it as such an embarrassment they didn't even want to talk about it. But that dig at the Orthodox Jews is important, because what Reform Jews were saying at the time, and Reform was just really solidifying in the 1870s, what they were saying is Jewish law does not instill morality. All Jewish law is a series of outdated strictures, but it doesn't make one a better person. And they were saying that on part also to explain, it's a critique of orthodoxy, but it's also justification for getting rid of the observance of Jewish law, because they drew a separation. Reform Jews drew a separation or distinction between morality and ethics and legal in the law, rituals, legal minutia of what you should eat and how you should, what kind of clothes you should wear and all that stuff. They said, look, Orthodox Jews are obsessed with these sorts of minutia, but it doesn't make them better people. And here's Pesach Rubenstein, perfect evidence of that. Here's a man in pious, he prays all the time. And what does he do? He commits a murder. A Reformed Jew wouldn't do that.
So isn't it interesting? I mean, of course, well, first of all, that's just like any news coverage is what suits your community and the paper it represents kind of thing. Not to be too narrow about that, but particularly when we're talking about these kind of small press situations. But isn't it interesting that it then takes so much digging on Eddy's part? I'm just curious when we talk about Jewish identity and we talk about uh, there's something, I don't want to derail too much, but let's say the concept of the mensch, which is sort of central to Jewish culture. This idea of a good Jewish man or a good man, a good Jewish boy.
It's a good person.
It's a decent
Menschlichkeit.
person. A decent person.
And that is a big, there's the original myth, which is the chosen people, and then there's the mensch. And these are big cornerstones of Jewish culture and life, right? Is that fair to say? At least philosophically. Yeah. And so this stuff just doesn't square with that, which is why we're talking about it today. Right. And I mean, any society, right. Nobody loves them. People don't, no one's proud of a murderer, but sometimes it is more central to the narrative, though, of some religions where you need the bad in order to highlight the good kind of thing. And we tend to not focus on the bad. We tend to focus on being better and better and better and righteous, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's interesting that, like, who wrote the books that you were reading? The History of the Jews of Brownsville, that it's like a little mention here, a little mention there. And I'm curious, I think you have one more tale for us, but that maybe we can do an abridged version of. I'm just curious, actually, you don't even have to tell the whole story. I'm just curious if there are other other murderers who pop up throughout the next, 125 years, or maybe earlier in Jewish history, but where we didn't know about them and then they had to be sort of unearthed, but they were important at the time. But then the culture sort of decides to close the Pandora's box on them because they don't jibe with the narrative. Does that make sense?
Right. So in the wake of the Rubenstein trial, you have, and incidentally, I just wanted to, create some closure by saying that he was not, in fact, hanged. He starved himself to death in prison, denying the hangman his.
How long did that? Work. How long did that take?
About a week. Not that long. He was kind of a mess. He refused to bathe.
It took him a week to starve to death.
Well, I think he was very sickly. These were the reports in the papers. But in the wake of the trial,
he used all the energy he had to murder her, and then he took to his
something like that.
Yeah.
But
the trial took its toll on an already poorly person.
It did. Yes. So in the wake of the trial, as I said, there were these 4 murder pamphlets published. The entire trial transcript was published as a book, for popular consumption. In addition, I found in an anthology of popular songs from the 1870s listed a song called "My Name is Pesach Rubenstein." Unfortunately, there's no music or lyrics, but that the fact that there was a popular song of that name is just astonishing. Yeah. Additionally, Yiddish papers of the period report that the amount of anti-Semitism in general increased fairly significantly, and Jews were chased down the street by kids throwing rocks and screaming "Rubenstein, Rubenstein, Rubenstein." The name Rubenstein became sort of a fill-in for Jew. It made life really difficult. Amazingly, also in the autobiography of Ab Khan, who was the editor of the Jewish Daily Forward, which was the largest Yiddish daily newspaper in history, he came to the United States in 1881. He wrote that when he arrived in the country, everyone on the Lower East Side was talking about the Pesach Rubenstein trial. That's 5 years after the Pesach
Wow.
Rubenstein trial. So it was something that deeply, deeply affected the Jewish community in really significant ways. And the fact that historians ignored this for so long is, to me, it's an indictment of American Jewish history, in this respect, for having ignored this, because it was really the most significant interface of Jews in American media in the history of the country up until that point.
But but here's the thing. What happens in the following decades is that Jews are increasingly in the spotlight as criminals and even murderers.
Yes, also true.
And sometimes those the accusations of murder are true, and other times they're completely fabricated. And this really weighs on Jews. So,
Is this
for
like
instance,
blood libel stuff?
there, well, it's a combination of so. First of all, in 1913, Leo Frank, a Jewish
Right.
factory manager in Atlanta, Georgia, is falsely accused of murder and rape, and then he's lynched. The lynching is very serious. It helps the whole scandal around it. Leads directly to the revival of the Ku Klux Klan, which had been dormant. It leads directly to the creation of the Anti-Defamation League. Jews realize that they need to start an organization to defend the good name of Jews. And half of Georgia's or half of the Jews of Atlanta leave the city permanently after that. I mean, that's the kind of scare there is around the lynching. I mean, it's unbelievable. So that's 1913. Then there's the blood libel accusation against Jews in 1928. That's in upstate New York, when a four-year-old girl wanders into the forest, wanders into the woods, disappears, and the town blames the Jews for killing her and using her blood for ritualistic purposes. Now, this is an old accusation. The blood libel is an old accusation in Europe. By this time, it's spread into the Middle East. But now, in the 1920s, it apparently had spread to the United States. Now, eventually, the girl was found, and the scandal died down. But still, it was yet another example of a false murder charge against Jews. So those were false. On the other hand, there were Jews, gangsters, for instance, were of course killing people all the time. Murder Incorporated also came into existence. This gang in Brownsville, Brooklyn, very near to Pesach Rubenstein committed the murder, is now a Jewish ghetto, Brownsville, and it's one of the poorest neighborhoods in New York City. And there was a gang dubbed Murder Incorporated, which specialized in killing people. I mean, upward of 1,000 people were killed by Jewish gangsters in this gang by 1941.
And they were they for
Jews
hire?
Organized crime. They were for hire. They were
contract hire them. Jewish
anyone
or not
could
Jewish.
hire their contractors. Yeah, then sometimes they worked with Italian gangsters too.
Well, isn't
right?
So yeah, I wonder, wasn't that Suge Knight's company, Murder Incorporated? I can't, or before Death Row, I can't remember. Or one of the albums is called Murder Inc. So
possibly,
I'm curious if they knew that the connection to that, or if they just that was their own idea.
I think Murder Inc. is a tattoo shop.
No, INC, Eddie, INC.
Murder Inc. is part of American popular culture. In 1960, there's a movie called Murder Incorporated, but in that starring Peter Falk and some others. But as I recall, Jewish references were taken out of the movie, so you didn't know it was a Jewish gang.
Right, so, and Jewish historians don't address these things until the 1980s, and even when they do, the Robert Rockaway, who wrote the book But He Was Good to His Mother, History of Jewish Gangsters in America, told me that when he wrote that book, the heads of virtually every major Jewish organization in the United States came to him and asked him not to publish the book. And he also claims that he was denied promotions in his department, because he had published this sort of, history of Jewish gangsters. So, American Jewish historians, to a large degree and for a long time, tried to ignore this aspect of Jewish life.
There's another scandal even before the Berkowitzes, and
yes, that's true.
That's the scandal of Leopold and Loeb. two
Right.
Jewish kids from Chicago who killed another Jewish kid. And this was became a very famous trial. Clarence Darrow defended them. They were found guilty.
Future Supreme Court
One was
Justice
murdered.
Clarence Darrow, right? Was he a Supreme Court justice? Or he was just a famous defense attorney?
I
Famous,
think he's just a famous
Okay.
defense
famous lawyer.
Sorry.
lawyer. But
He was
one of
related
those,
to Upton. He was related to Upton Sinclair.
St. Clair, Upton St. Clair.
We'll cut that. We'll also cut the Murder Inc. thing I said because I looked it up and it's a different company altogether. But anyway, go on, Tony.
But anyway, so Leopold and Loeb were all over the news for this really carried out this vicious murder of a neighbor, and they were quite brazen about it. It was totally, and these weren't kids from the Jewish ghetto. These were actually wealthy Jewish kids of German Jewish background. And
what were the circumstances?
and
What were the circumstances of the murder?
circumstances that these two guys, these two friends, I think they were about 18, 19, who were apparently very good students, highly intelligent. Possibly, it seems they had a romantic relationship, and had it in their heads that they were fascinated by their understanding of Nietzsche and his notion of the Superman, who stands above the law and outside the law. So they thought, well, we're brilliant, we're geniuses.
What would it feel like to kill somebody?
What would it feel like to kill somebody? So those were the circumstances, and they went to jail. One was killed in prison by a fellow prisoner. The other was eventually released, I think, in the late 1950s. Totally humiliating, but again, going back to the Jewish communal perspective, this was scandalous and humiliating.
And so then, I guess David Berkowitz is the next most. I mean, obviously, I'm sure there's people in between, but that's the next big blip where people have to deal with the sensationalism of a trial and it hitting the mainstream media, basically, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right. I mean, not only that, it's Son of Sam is a major trial. Yeah. Like it's this was that summer.
But it's so interesting that the ADL asked that the guy who wrote but he was good to his mother. Is that what it's called? Which is such a great title for a book. That they were like, could you not?
Well,
on the other hand, how big? You get it. It's like the community is so small. Why draw attention? Why are we going to vilify ourselves? I mean, this is the nature of PR, essentially.
It's not just that the community was small. It's that anti-Semitism in this country became very serious by the 1920s, even more so in the 30s into the 40s, and so Jews were vulnerable. They not just felt vulnerable.
Yes,
they were vulnerable.
add to that. But I would think the ADL would say that we're always just one bad case or one bad story away from that same vulnerability. And not to get too heavy, and I don't want to get into this, but we've certainly seen that in the last couple of years, if not months. That the scales can tip quickly. Right. So as much as we want to talk about the identity politics of it, I mean, it's all of these things, but this idea that it doesn't really square with the basic values of Jewish religion and culture. And it's also a very dangerous thing to potentially open yourself up to. I'm curious how the New York Jewish community reacted to Berkowitz and Son of Sam, if you guys know anything about that. But we should also wrap it up soon, guys, because it's getting to be that time.
All right. I mean, I think, in the end, the Jewish position is always one of precariousness. One trial, one thing like this that reflects poorly on the Jewish community, history sort of shows that it can all come crumbling down.
Right, and
quickly.
this shitty inverse of that being that you can be good and a great contributor to society, and in some quadrants of this world, there's always somebody looking to say, "See, I told you that they killed babies."
Right. Yeah. Well, that's a happy note to end on.
I'll give you a happy note. I haven't killed anybody. Never done it.
Not today, anyways.
Not today, no.
But that is the
Never done
thing
it.
with the blood libel thing. It always resurfaces. I mean, obvious, and it's
Oh,
tied,
yeah.
and it's called different things, and it's tied into different things, and it's, they repackage it and they repurpose it and whatever it is. But it it's always just the one bad. I mean, it goes for everything in life, but the one bad deed is the thing that people want to remember you for, not or that want to associate
Sure,
you
of
with,
course.
not which shows the predisposition to believe ill of a group of people or a person. I mean, it happens individually too, obviously, but there we are.
Well, I think ill of everyone.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, at least you're
So
consistent.
yeah.
Guys, this was really fascinating for me anyway. If there's even 6 people still listening, I mean, God bless them. But really, it is fascinating because it's ultimately about reflection, or I don't want to say self-reflection because it makes it seem too individual, but how a community chooses or doesn't choose to hold a mirror up to itself. And if you're interested in more fascinating snippets from Jewish culture and history, I definitely recommend Eddy's book. Which, Eddy, where can people get that, and tell them what it's called and where they can get it?
The book is called Bad Rabbi and Other Strange But True Stories from the Yiddish Press. Ooh, look at that. Tony's got a copy. Wow. I'm so impressed. It is available from Stanford University Press's website or bookshop.org, is it? Or, Amazon.
We'll put a link in the episode notes so people can get the book. But it's a terrific book and a great read, and is very
Thank
much
you.
what we're doing here, which is the looking at the outliers and what does that say about us.
The strange but true aspects of Jewish
Yeah.
history.
There you go.
True.
Guys, this has been absolutely delightful. I look forward to our next meeting. I'm Jessica Chaffin saying nothing but goodbye to Tony Michels, and Dr. Tony Michels, and Dr. Eddy Portnoy.
Thank you.